Hello, and welcome to my series on classical music cadences. In this video we'll go over the basics regarding the perfect authentic cadence, which is the most conclusive one. Often equiparated with the period in the speech, the perfect authentic cadence serves as a distinctive ending articulation, which allows for the clear separation of the different materials of a musical piece, be it phrases, themes, or complete sections. Technically speaking, the perfect authentic cadence is a dominant to tonic progression, fifth to first scale degree, where both chords are in root position. The tonic chord must present its root note on the top voice, which must also be approached by step motion from the previous chord. Finally, the tonic chord must also be a perfect triad, either major or minor. This rules out any other kind of triads, such as diminished or augmented, which were considered dissonant and not suitable for a conclusive function. It's worth noting that the addition of sixths, sevenths, ninths, or any other type of added note to a tonic function chord was completely foreign to the 18th century classical style, despite their common use today. Now, let's see how to build a perfect authentic cadence, starting from its two basic elements, bass and top voice. In a perfect authentic cadence, the bass line moves from the fifth to the first degree of a given key, which means either a leap of a perfect fifth down or a perfect fourth up. Both options fall into one single category, which is the so-called bass clausula. Now, for the top voice of a perfect authentic cadence, it's mandatory that the last note is the tonic, in this case the note C, which is also the root of the last chord. This last note must be reached by step motion either from above, which is the tenor clausula, or from below, the discant or soprano clausula. Despite their different names, both clausula were equally appropriate for the top voice, and it was up to the composer to decide which one to use in each case, usually attending to melodic criteria. Three-part voicing. Assuming we have a perfect authentic cadence with a tenor clausula on the top voice, this means that the first chord already has its root note on the bass and its fifth above it. Therefore, it's necessary to also include its third as inner voice in order to complete the triad. This note, B in this case, is called the leading tone, and it must always resolve up to the tonic, a minor second above. This naturally leads to a triplication of the tonic in the last chord, which is perfectly fine in this context of three-part harmony. Now, if we've got a discant clausula on the top voice instead, there are a few more options to consider, being the most common one to complete the triad by adding the fifth of the chord as inner voice. This note resolves by step motion either a second up or a second down. A less common option is to duplicate the root of the first chord. In three-part harmony, this note must always resolve downwards to the third of the second chord. The reason why this note should not be maintained along both chords is because that'd lead to an open fifth, which is a very specific sonority that occurs when a triad lacks its third but retains its fifth. Keep in mind that there is nothing intrinsically wrong with this sonority, which has been favored through different musical periods, places, and styles in history. However, during the 18th century classical era, this was considered a harsh sonority, and it was normally avoided unless the composer wanted to play rough. It's also worth noting that the duplicated root of the first chord should not resolve to the tonic, as it'd lead to consecutive octaves with the bass. As a result, this wouldn't feel like three-part writing anymore, but rather as two-part harmony with a double bass line. Four-part voicing. In a perfect authentic cadence with a tenor clausula on the top line, the filling of the inner voices is pretty straightforward, with the third of the chord and the duplication of the root. These notes resolve just like in three-part writing, with the leading tone going up to the tonic and the duplication of the root down to its third. In the case of a discant clausula on the top voice, the normal procedure is completing the triad with its fifth, and also duplicating the root. Since the fifth can resolve either up or down, this leads to a few different possible outcomes. Notice that it's now possible to maintain the duplication of the dominant chord's root note as a common tone, as long as any other voice resolves to the final chord's third, in order to avoid unwanted open fifth sonorities. More voices can be added from here, which is useful and sometimes unavoidable in orchestral music, but they'll mostly behave as doubled voices. This means that two or more voices play the same notes, one or more octaves apart, so even if we've got 8 voices in this example, they still count as only 4 real parts. Rules regarding doubling are flexible, for they entirely depend on the musical context and acoustic matters. However, when doubling, it's advised to keep the original bass and top line in the lowest and highest register respectively, even if played at different octaves, in order to avoid unwanted changes in the chord's position. Dominant seventh. Originally, the dominant seventh was introduced as a passing tone between the dominant chord's root and the tonic chord's third, which is known as the alto clausula. However, during the 18th century classical era, the dominant seventh was commonly used as part of the dominant chord. The dominant seventh was considered a special type of dissonance, one that didn't require preparation, which means this note didn't need to be introduced in the same voice in the previous chord, but that always had to be resolved downwards by step motion, like any other dissonance. This would naturally lead to a triplication of the root note on the tonic chord. However, there were 2 alternatives in order to get a complete triad of the tonic chord at the end of this cadence. One was to simply omit the fifth of the dominant chord and duplicating the root note instead. Notice that leaving out the fifth of the dominant chord would also be the way to go for 3-part writing, but it would also require to omit the dominant chord's root duplication, hence leading to an incomplete tonic chord. The other one was the irregular resolution of the leading tone, the third of the dominant chord, which would resolve downwards instead of moving up by step. It's important to point out that this kind of irregular resolution was only acceptable if said leading tone was an inner voice. While it's generally assumed that a dominant seventh chord resolving to tonic provides a stronger conclusive feeling than the plain dominant triad, this doesn't mean that the use of the dominant seventh was mandatory in every cadence. Both types of chords have different sonorities, and the composers would choose one or the other depending on multiple factors. Moreover, there are plenty of examples of plain triad cadences that manage to give a very satisfactory conclusive feeling without the need of a dominant seventh. Direct and delayed resolutions. So far, all the examples we've seen displayed direct resolutions of the dominant chord, meaning the tonic chord appears right away. But there was another common type of resolution, which is what I call delayed, in which the top voices of the dominant chord are maintained as suspensions during at least one beat after the resolution of the bass. We can find this particular type of resolution not only in relation to perfect authentic cadences, but to other types of cadences as well, especially in minuets and slow tempi movements. Cadential 6/4. The cadential 6/4 is the most conclusive type of perfect authentic cadence, and it was normally reserved for the ending of important sections of the piece. In this type of cadence, the dominant harmony is prolonged along two events before resolving to tonic. In the first part, we have the dominant root on the bass, while the upper voices correspond to the tonic triad, yet behaving as suspensions that must be resolved downwards by step. In the second part, the dominant chord is presented complete, with or without its dominant seventh, before proceeding to the tonic as in a simple perfect authentic cadence. Notice how the bass note should be maintained throughout the first two chords of a cadential 6/4. However, leaping one octave down before reaching the tonic was also a very common approach for this particular cadence. Cadential progressions. A cadential progression is the succession of chords that lead to a cadence and prepare its conclusive role. Perfect and also imperfect authentic cadences are preceded by authentic cadential progressions, which can be classified in two types, complete and incomplete. In an incomplete authentic cadential progression, the dominant, be it a simple triad, a dominant seventh or a cadential 6/4, is only preceded by a tonic function chord, the tonic triad either in root position or in first inversion. This is considered a weak type of cadential progression, for it lacks the sufficient harmonic movement to build up enough expectation towards its resolution. For this reason, we won't usually find this type of cadential progression as the ending of important passages in a musical piece. On the contrary, this kind of progressions are normally seen in post-cadential passages, such as codas, codettas, and the like. In a complete authentic cadential progression, the dominant harmony is preceded by a predominant function chord different than the tonic. The fourth and second scale degree triads, usually included into the subdominance group, are by far the most common predominant function chords in the classical era. Notice how the bass line progresses in a very characteristic motion through the fourth and fifth scale degrees. This specific bass line is sometimes referred to as the gallant cadence, and it's one of the most recurrent patterns in classical music's cadential passages. The gallant cadence could also appear in its compound form, adapted to cadential 6/4 resolutions. The occasional use of the fourth scale degree as a minor triad in the major mode was also possible, but it should be regarded more as an expressive exception than a rule. The second scale degree was oftenly used in first inversion, which allowed to retain the gallant cadence bass line motion. The addition of a diatonic seventh to the second scale degree chord was also common. As a dissonance, it was advised that this seventh should be prepared from the previous chord and resolved moving down by step. In the minor mode, the fourth scale degree is by default a minor triad. even if it was acceptable to occasionally borrow the minor triad of the fourth degree into the major mode, the other way around was not. The triad built on the second scale degree in the minor mode is by default a diminished triad. Due to their dissonant sonority, this particular type of triads were mostly used in first inversion. Additionally, in four-part writing, it was advised to duplicate its third instead of the root. Oftenly, composers would turn this diminished triad into a minor one by raising its fifth a half tone, especially if said note was on the top voice. Commonly referred to as the melodic minor scale, this was meant to prevent the resulting augmented second melodic interval between this note and the third of the dominant chord, which was considered harsh and hard to sing. Another way to prevent the diminished sonority of the second scale degree in minor mode was to lower the root a half tone, hence turning the triad into a major one. This is what many theorists call the Neapolitan sixth. Secondary dominance. Secondary dominance might be inserted before the dominant in an authentic cadential progression. By far, the most common secondary dominant used in this context is the diminished seventh chord, built over the dominant's seventh scale degree. In this type of chord, the dominant's leading tone must always be resolved a half tone upwards to the dominant's root note, no matter the chord's inversion. On the other hand, the diminished seventh, like all the sevenths, is supposed to be resolved downwards by step, unless, like in this case, the next chord is a cadential 6/4. The normative resolution of the diminished seventh only occurs when the following chord is the dominant triad. A less common type of secondary dominance in the context of an authentic cadential progression are the augmented sixths. This type of chords present an augmented sixth interval from the bass, which must be resolved in contrary motion to a perfect octave in the next one, with the bass descending one half tone, and the augmented sixth ascending. The rest of the chord can be filled in different ways, leading to different types of augmented sixth chords, which is a topic I may discuss in depth in another video. In this case we've got a so-called German augmented sixth, with a perfect fifth above the bass. Like in our previous example regarding diminished sevenths, this note is meant to resolve downwards when the following chord is the dominant triad, but it also resolves upwards when it leads to a cadential 6/4. In these cases some composers prefer to rewrite this chord as follows, which is the so-called enharmonic German augmented sixth or Swiss augmented sixth. Nevertheless, in equal temperament the sounds are still the same, so the distinction between both types is merely visual. Finally, it's worth noting that the subdominant chords in an authentic cadential progression can also be preceded by their own secondary dominants. That's all for now. Let me know if this video was helpful, and see you next time.